welcome to Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast with Renae Hanvin, which is all about inspiring you to start thinking and doing disasters a little bit differently too. In this episode, I'm talking with Daniel Aldrich, the Professor and Director of the Resilience and Security Studies Program at Northeastern University in the USA. And we're talking about social capital is the foundation for building national resilience. Now, a little bit about Daniel. Daniel P. Aldrich was born in upstate New York and spent his childhood and much of his adult life traveling and living abroad. While living in Tokyo, Japan, he began to wonder how Japan, the only country to suffer the effects of atomic weaponry, could have built up such an advanced nuclear power program. He wrote up his observations in the book Site Fights, published by Cornell University Press. In 2005, he and his family had their home, car, and all of their material possessions in New Orleans destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, and began studying what makes communities and neighbourhoods more resilient. He published Building Resilience to share these insights on the role of friends, neighbours, and social cohesion after crisis. After Japan was hit by the devastating triple disasters of an earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in March 2011, Daniel wrote Black Wave about the factors that helped people and communities bounce back. I like to start with where we met. I had heard a lot about Daniel from a previous visit he made to Australia, and I was intrigued to hear more about this so-called social capital concept. It wasn't until I was kindly invited to a small group conversation where Daniel was the guest speaker in Sydney a couple of years ago that I saw and heard firsthand how important his research and focus on social ties is. Given C2C is 100% stakeholder-led, it was, on my part anyway, a case of people resilience love at first sight. I'm so excited to have Daniel on the episode today to share his focus on bonding, bridging, and linking ties. I'm also really honoured to say that Daniel is an advisory committee member of our national approach, the Resilient Australia Alliance, which you'll be hearing a lot more about in the coming months. Now, if you haven't read Daniel's books or watched a YouTube video on his 3 areas of social ties, you need to put down whatever you're doing right now and buy it or view it, or maybe wait until after you've listened to our conversation. Daniel, thanks so much. It's really great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can you share a little more about your role at Northeastern and the road you've taken to become what I and so many others refer to you as the global expert in social capital?
That's very kind. A very kind title. So I love my job. I'm very lucky. I'm the director of the program on security and resilience. And I help design curricula for undergraduate and graduate students studying these topics. And of course, I get to be a professor and work on things that are really, really critical to me, but also critical to people around the world. That all began for me now almost 15 years ago. I was just on my first job as an academic after my PhD was done. We had driven down from Boston, where we lived my wife had to go to graduate school, and we went to New Orleans, Louisiana. We were there for about 6 weeks. And unfortunately for us, we picked a time to move right before Hurricane Katrina arrived.
Oh.
And that arrival meant that our neighborhood, all the neighborhoods nearby, we lived in a place called Lakeview. Indeed, our house became Lakeview. We had around 12 feet of water in our house. So everything that we had just purchased, when you have that very first job, we were so excited to have that. So we got a new car, we got a new, we got clothing and stuff for the kid. We at that point 2 young kids, and we got furniture and books. And of course, it was all destroyed. Now, we were really lucky in the sense that we were saved. Not because of our foresight or our wisdom. In fact, we were dumb enough to think we could stay. That was our plan, to stay through the hurricane in a one-story house. But we were saved because a neighbor, Kathy, one of our people we had just met a few weeks ago, came to our house really late, I think around midnight, and knocked on the door and said, Daniel, you guys got to get out. This is not safe. And her coming to our house, or her showing that level of interest in us, got us out of there. And that really began for me thinking about this broader question, and the whole thing that happened afterwards to me. We did not have insurance. We were not good planners, not very wise, had no insurance. So we had at the time no job because my job was suspended. We had nothing left because of our house was destroyed. Our 2 young kids were sitting together in a small hotel in Houston, wondering what's going to happen next. And I had this vision of disasters and recovery as coming from maybe 2 different places. One of them was going to be from the government. The government would come save me. And the other was the idea that somehow the free market would save me, right? Somehow maybe we had some quiet insurance we forgot about, or maybe my parents had insurance. And of course, it turned out that FEMA rejected all of our attempts at getting money for months, over half a year. And of course, we didn't have insurance. So, but what did save us, though, what helped us the most, were our friends of friends, people we'd never met, but they were in our networks. And that began a long journey for me to think through, okay, well, these shocks like Hurricane Katrina, these aren't that uncommon, actually. So is our story as a family, of a family that got through, not because we were smart, not because we were wise, or we had, a house 20 feet off the ground or whatever else, technocratic solutions. We were saved because a neighbor knew who we were and knocked on our door and told us to get out. And then we were saved because friends of friends said, hey, if you need a place to stay or need a school for your kids, we have spaces for you. So that kind of began a long process. So I wrote a book not long after called Building Resilience, which was my attempt to understand how these disasters had happened in North America, in India, and in Japan. I worked on another book on disasters in East Asia. Then I worked on a broader book on how communities can recover. And just about a year ago, I finished up my most recent book, which was called Black Wave, focused on Japan's 3/11 triple disasters. And all of those have the same story, my wife would say. They're just telling the story with different covers, which is that I always go and talk to people. I just talk to people who survived. I talk to family members who had relatives who didn't survive. I talk to NGOs and mayors, and I ask the same questions. What happened here? How's it getting better? And the stories seem to coalesce around this idea that our networks, the kind of connections that we have, are so critical, often in ways we don't think about during peacetime.
You're so true. Do you know what I love? I love that your story, it's kind of same, but different to mine. So mine started when I was actually on the last plane allowed to land on the East Coast of America on September 11. So I found myself, funnily enough, in Boston, where you are now, as a complete stranger for 2.5 weeks. I couldn't get out. And these strangers became my community because I didn't know anyone there. I didn't have anyone there. And they were there to kind of help me and help me get through. So I love that, your experience and my experience, I guess it sets off that passion in the belly for wanting to research more and do something more about it. Now, for those who've not heard about the term of social capital, I often refer to your 3 types of social capital, so bonding, bridging, and linking ties. Can you just explain it a bit more for those who haven't heard about it?
Yeah, of course. We all recognize that we have things that matter, our friendships, our connections, perhaps during COVID-19 even more, right? The things that we miss, getting hugs, going to concerts, praying together, eating together with people, having that time together with people. And social scientists divide those ties into what we call bonding, bridging, and linking ties. And bonding ties are the connections that are the most common between people who are very similar. So, for example, the kind of ties you and your family would share would be bonding ties. People that to look like you, sound like you, went to the same schools, same ethnicity, caste, religion, race, all that stuff, those are bonding ties. And those are probably the most common. All of us hopefully have some of those. Those are different than bridging ties. Bridging ties connect us to people who are different. Different ethnically, religiously, their thoughts are different. Maybe they're Democrat, you're Republican. Maybe they're wealthy and you're poor. Maybe you're a person of color and they're white. So those ties are less common, but really, really critical. And actually, part of the fun stuff that we do with our lab is try to understand how these different connections play a role at different times, right? So those bonding ties are really, really helpful during a shock, right? Someone has a heart attack in your apartment complex, or there's a fire, like we had this actually a few months ago, there's a fire in the house behind us. So, right, all of us in the apartment complex where I live immediately mobilized, right, to help each other out. Those are all horizontal connections, the bonding and bridging ties. In contrast, if we're lucky, we have vertical ties called linking social ties. And those between normal people like me and someone in power, maybe the mayor of Boston or the governor of Massachusetts, or maybe the president, someone who has authority and can do something, right? So if you think about it, right, those bonding, bridging, and linking ties can bring very different things, right? First of all, the vertical ties can bring resources. So if everyone in my neighborhood got hit by a flood, but the governor can bring down, who knows, relief money or a tent city or assistance, right? That's a really powerful tie to have. At the same time, bridging ties can bring new information as well as new procedures and new ways of thinking about the problem, right? So maybe my bonding network, the way they solve solutions might be quite similar to mine, right? Their approaches may be the same. But if I have a really broad network, right, and I've got more diverse ties, I can handle new problems in different ways. And that's what a lot of research backs up, a very strong body of evidence that basically the broader kinds of connections, the more of these bridging ties you have, and the more linking ties, vertical ties you have, the better off you're going to be than just having, for example, great friends and family. Hopefully, all of us have good friends and family. Maybe we have the occasional tiff or whatever, but it's really, getting beyond those, mom and pop and auntie Jenny, right? Connections that really help us during shocks.
And I guess when I talk about the disaster space, I find that a lot of the organizations or government departments, they have their traditional networks, their traditional partnerships and collaborations, but it's really about, I guess, evolving out of those and having more of those bridging and linking ties so that we can all get to know each other and build those relationships before, so that when a disaster strikes, they're ready to go. Now, in the disaster space, traditionally, I find there's been a lot of focus in Australia on infrastructure or things. So when it comes to resilience, it's like, bridges and buildings and roads, because they can be funded and fixed in front of our eyes. They get a lot of the main focus. But gaining funding or awareness on the social capital or the people aspect of resilience, it's been a pretty hard slog, I've got to be honest, because it hasn't really been on the radar until maybe the late part of 2020 when the bushfires and COVID kicked in. I must say that, in my opinion, I think there's a long way to go in building social capital across Australian communities. So can I ask, what's been your experience from the work you've done around the world in terms of gaining funding or support for social capital-led resilience programs and outcomes?
Yeah, I think much similar to your experiences, it's been a hard uphill battle in many cases. One of my favorite stories is there's this amazing program that began in Japan after the 11 disasters, right afterwards. And we were so happy, so proud of this process. And the simple reality was that all the funding came from outside Japan.
Wow.
None of the money came from the Japanese government. None of the money came from the local government. The money came from an American aerospace supplier, right?
Wow.
That had to help, that was sort of doing its corporate social responsibility, and their money gave the seed money for this program. Now, this program was so successful that it actually spread from Japan to the Nepal and Philippines. It's called Ibasho. But I think that story, right, where the money for an incredibly successful social capital program that is helping build ties isn't coming from the community itself, it's not coming from the government, is pretty normal for me. It's actually, we're doing a project right now. I'm working on a new book looking at these different investments. You've mentioned bridges and roads and this kind of stuff, what we call physical infrastructure. And that's a big contrast, right, to this social infrastructure, right, the ties that we have to each other, these bonding, bridging, and linking ties. And we just measured so far in two different places. The one is the national budget in Japan, how money in disasters is spent. Is it spent on physical infrastructure or social infrastructure? And our first cut shows something like 95% of the money being spent in Japan on disasters is completely on physical infrastructure. Seawalls, hardening buildings, raising up roads, all that kind of stuff. And I wish I could tell you that here in Boston it's different, but I'm sad to say we've tracked so far 85 projects in Boston over the past 15 years, almost exactly the same ratio, over 90% of the money being spent in what I think is a progressive, modern city full of really smart people. Not just me, but a lot of people much smarter than me. And unfortunately, the same ratio is that so much of the money has gone into seawalls and sea barriers and all this kind of stuff to slow the arrival of the ocean. And very little money has gone into things like citizen science, trust, zoning engagement, civic engagement, getting people to know their neighbors, all the stuff that we need during these shocks. So it is, I think, a universal problem that for governments, especially local and regional governments, where they only have, let's say, a few years in office, they want to build something that's visible. And building those roads and bridges and dams and ports and all that kind of stuff, it can point to people and say, look what I built. I built this and that and the other. It's much harder to say, what we built? A program where people are feeling trust in each other and the government, or a program where people now have more friends, or a program where people engage more in civic engagement. They spend more time voting or whatever. Those don't sound, I think, as good to a politician. And that's really where the political will, right? Much of the budgetary stuff that happens is really far removed, right, from local communities. It's in the hands of a few people, right, who often think in terms of re-election.
Oh, 100%. And I have to say, I would love, and in fact, I might make a few calls after this conversation. I'd love you to include Australia in your research for this, because I think the numbers would be exactly the same. And I think it's staggering, to see how much is put into exactly that, building roads or bridges or something that can have that, red or blue tape that gets cut, at the photo opportunity. Yet, as we're about to go on, because I'm about to mention some of my favorite quotes of yours, like it's the people build the resilience. So, we don't need necessarily all the buildings and that if the people are not going to be there to be resilient as well. Now, over the years, I've just mentioned some quotes. So over the years, I've copied and shared so many of your quotes, and I'm going to share some of my favorites, if you wouldn't mind just expanding on them a little bit in terms of why they're so important. So this one I love: connected communities are more resilient than affluent communities.
Yeah, so this is funny. A lot of times people will talk to me and say, you know what? I'm sure this is all about wealth, right? It's really about having the money, having the income. And the funny thing is, actually, this is true around the world. Oftentimes, communities which don't have huge amounts of material endowments, a lot of money, a lot of insurance, they're exactly the ones that recognize the power of this kind of stuff, right? They're the ones who can build these kind of connections, and they have to, right? Because at some level, for them, it's almost like a substitute, right, for that deep bank account or big pockets, or having a spouse who's a banker or whatever. That's often the case. So what we found, for example, and this is some of my research in Japan, is some of the poorest communities and the most vulnerable ones are the ones where these kind of ties are really surfacing the most and doing the most good. To the degree you can imagine, if you're, I don't know, Donald Trump, you don't really need your neighbors to know you or like you, right? You have whatever people you can hire to do your work for you, or maybe you're so removed from the kind of day-to-day shocks that most of us handle, like COVID-19, for example, right, or whatever else is going on. It doesn't even matter, and you don't need to mitigate those kind of things. So building up those social ties may not even be on your agenda. Maybe you see people as threats, right, and you prefer not to have to build those kind of ties. So yeah, that idea that an old idea, I think, that somehow wealth is the most important thing. And by the way, we also have a really cool study that we did of the community of Futaba, which used to live right next to the nuclear power plants that melted down in Japan. And there we tracked them for about 5 years after the Fukushima meltdowns to understand their mental health processes, how things were going for them. And again, we thought there as well that, okay, well, the wealthiest residents who used to live there, who had to evacuate, of course they'll do better, right? They can hire therapists, they can move away further, they can get a new job, or they don't even need a job maybe. The simple reality was having wealth wasn't a shield against mental health anxiety. What really helped the most for everybody, poor, middle class, and wealthy alike, were having social ties. So yeah, over and over again, we're seeing that, I'm sure for those people who are wealthy, good for them, that's great, but that's not enough, right? Having that money, and of course the irony could be, by the way, if your house is flooding or there's a heart attack, wealth is not going to help you right then, right? You really
Exactly.
need someone nearby to step in and intervene, or in the long term, let's say, right, build ties to decision makers who decide, what are we spending our money on in society, right? Are we going to, I don't know, build houses up the hill? Or are we going to try and get people in the community that are vulnerable to stick together?
Yeah, I love that one. Now, another one I really like is social networks. And in fact, I say this and a lot of people stare at me like I'm making it up. So as soon as you confirm it, then I'm going to post it out to a lot of those people. So social networks matter more than bottled water and batteries.
Yeah. So this is another thing I get a lot. Okay, so Daniel, I hear what you're saying, but look, I'm a hoarder, I'm a prepper, whatever the phrase you have, in Australia. I'm the person who has all the stuff right in my house ready for the next shock. And they have, actually, I met a family, very nice people. They had drilled into the hill behind their home about 30 feet. And this is their property, and they'd filled that cave with food, bottled water, all that kind of stuff, which is great. But the simple reality is, during a shock, your network needs to have those things. You
Mm.
don't need to have those things. So I'll give you an example, a nice one. My family and I lived briefly in a place called Silver Spring, Maryland, which is outside Washington, D.C. I was working for the government at the time. And for some reason, the power grid in that city just did not stay up. It would go down for a day or two at a time. And of course, we have kids, we had ice cream. And every time the power would go off, my wife would say, quick, go to the neighbor's house. Why? Well, these really, really nice neighbors, they had a generator. And every time the power went off, they would tell all the neighbors, we have a huge freezer, bring your stuff over here, leave it in our freezer until we're done. Now, that's a very nice, simple, nothing complicated example. But that's the kind of thing, right? I don't need to have every technical device, a satellite phone, a pickaxe or whatever, to handle these stuff. I need to know someone who has those things, right? So my grandmother, for example, when she was alive, she didn't necessarily have everything, but she knew everyone in the community who did. So if I came to say to her, Grandma, can I borrow something? She'd point me in the direction and say, 2 doors down on the left, he has what you need. And that's the kind of thing social networks get us. That, for example, again, wealth can't necessarily get us all those weird nooks and crannies, or borrowing sugar or whatever else. So absolutely, right? It's not about you having every single thing on that preparedness list, whatever that list looks like. And it's not even having the weird things, satellite phones or a pop-up tent. It's being in a network that has a sense of community that can work together collectively. One more example I just thought of. This came from Kobe in 1995 after the earthquake. There were 2 communities side by side, Mano and Mikura, literally side by side, same size communities, and a fire broke out in between the 2 of them. And one of the communities watched as the fire burned their homes and businesses down, and the other put it out with a bucket brigade, literally running to the nearest river and passing buckets of water back to where the fire was, right? You have to ask yourself, why didn't both communities do that, right? Both of them had access to buckets and the river and everything else. Well, I interviewed people and they said, very simple, in one community, they worked together regularly. They trusted each other. They'd spent time together, right? They didn't need to have, operating pumps and a fancy, diesel powered whatever. They needed to have the ability to work together, to trust each other. If I say, I'm going to grab the buckets, you go grab Mrs. Smith, and you go grab the whatever, and we're going to make a line. Trust me when I'm saying that we're all going to be there, right? If you don't know who I am, if we've never met before, if we've never worked together before, it's going to be really hard to organize a bucket brigade, right? As that fire is coming, because you're thinking about yourself. So anyway, that's those moments, right? These things, batteries, bottled water, those are great to have. But again, if you don't have them, I would say social networks might be a little more important.
Oh, 100%. I'm sold. You don't need to sell the conversation to me. Now, as you know, at C2C, one of our social enterprise solutions that we offer to communities is co-design grants. And this is where we collaborate with communities to identify some projects that will deliver to their needs. And then we submit for some grant funding as a collective. Last year, we submitted 4 projects and we've done 2 so far this year as well. And we've included in all of them a really important role for you, which I'm so hopeful that we'll get the grant funding for. Now, the communities we've been collaborating with are really excited at the possibility to have your knowledge and help in building social capital should we be successful, because it is something that is kind of not really talked about and a lot of communities don't really know how to do. So what's been so great is that just by leading the process of bringing some community organizations and people together to create the actual grant submission is that we've actually built connections. So rather than all these different organizations and people submitting different grants, they've come together to think of a community-wide benefit and submit these grants in, which I think is a massive, just organic step even before any funding's given out. So Daniel, can I ask, what are some of the simplest forms of building social capital that you've seen in communities?
Yeah, one of my favorite examples actually comes from a neighbor of yours from New Zealand, from the city of Wellington. And this is the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Organization, WREMO for short, WREMO. And this is a few years back. And they knew they had a large community there who spoke English as a second language, right? So hard for them to read complicated signs. Many of them had just arrived as migrants from other countries, from Afghanistan to Syria. And they were thinking, well, look, we have these shocks, right, where we have earthquakes and we have the possibility of tsunami, a real possibility here. So how can we get everyone on board and get them to a safe place, even if they don't necessarily have complicated radio instructions or big signs or whatever else? So they did the opposite of what I would normally do. Rather than brainstorming on their own, they went into the community and they sat down with local residents, people, for example, who spoke both, let's say, Pashtun and English, or whatever other languages were there, and said, okay, if we have a shock, how can we tell you what's going on? What can we do? And out of those community-based brainstorming sessions came the idea of painting safe areas blue. If you've ever been to parts of Wellington, yeah, there are these really beautiful blue parts of the streets. And I used to think, oh, this is so nice, it's like a walking zone. No, that's a tsunami safe zone. You don't need to speak English. Even kids can recognize, right, how far up the hill you need to go to be in a safe zone. That's the kind of stuff, right? So first of all, the process itself of getting it done was a bottom-up, community-driven process, right? It wasn't from some smart person with a PhD from ANU or whatever it's going to be from Victoria. It came from the community. And then the solution itself is also community-based, right? You don't need to have a central authority on Facebook or someone sending out radio messages or whatever. Literally there in the community are the signs you need to be safe. I think that's one really good example. And I think the other one I really like a lot is the Ibasho example in Japan, the one I mentioned before. This was a program started by the local community. And they said, we've all been evacuated from different communities to this new resettlement area. We don't know anybody at all. How can we build ties in a way, not just me running into you, on the way to the bathhouse or on the way to the garbage?
Mhm.
How do we do this deliberately? And they thought, we just need a physical space. We have all these basically FEMA like trailers, aluminum trailers, 20 feet long, 10 feet wide. There's no space for having guests over or meeting outside. Let's get a space. And that's what they did, right? And as I mentioned, they work with a few academics, someone like Emi Kyoto was one of the founders of that organization, fundraised from a North American organization and built a space. Nothing complicated, right? No complicated things there, but that space was multi-purpose. So some days they'd have yoga classes, some days they had cooking classes. Other days they'd have a seminar for young kids on how to make origami, and the next day they'd have a library reading day, right? And they were just trying to make a space in the community. Again, nothing complicated here. They thought about it, and again, two things you think about. One, bottom-up idea, not some expert based in Tokyo telling them what they needed, but rather the community itself thinking through it. And the solution was very straightforward. Again, nothing complicated. We don't need a flow chart of this and that and the other or complicated technical stuff. I know a lot of people get excited about new apps and, this and that, the other web-based, whatever. No, just a physical building where people
Yeah.
could sit together. And in that space, right, in the flexibility of that space, you have the chance to do it whatever you need to do, right? So it wasn't that, for example, you had to have something complicated, and especially, by the way, for the elderly, right, for whom an app might be the end of that conversation, right? Telling my parents right now, actually, my wife is incredible. She's actually managed to secure COVID-19 shots for a number of our elderly friends, because for them, operating these, quote, simple apps is not within the realm of something they want to deal with right now in their 70s and 80s. So again, a simple solution, a physical space, multi-purpose, run by the community, blue lines drawn on the ground. Now, these are the kind of things. I'll give you one more example I like also. This is from the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, the NEN in San Francisco. And they wanted a way to build connections. And they figured out, look, here's what we can do. We can't retrofit all the buildings in San Francisco against the earthquake that's coming, but we can try to build social ties. So how can we do that? Everyone likes a party, a good party. So here's what we're going to do. Every community that proposes a party idea, we'll give them $5,000 to hold that party, to block off traffic, to have a bounce house for the kids and barbecue for the adults, or a flagpole to run around, whatever it's going to be, on condition no one is excluded. And they have at least one small table where they talk about working together. They have to plan the party themselves, get the permits themselves. Again, here, the way the parties might look is going to be completely different. Maybe you'll have a rave with electronic dance music and strobe lights, and the other community will have classical lute players outside, and they'll all be doing mayflower, whatever it's going to be. But again, the community has to plan the party together. Even the working together process itself helps them build those kind of connections. And again, it's a bottom-up process. The city hall is not telling community X and community Y, you both need to have the same party. No, community X has their lute festival and community Y has the EDM, and both are happy.
I love that. And that's the thing too. It's the process that I guess can build so much more in terms of social capital and the connections than it is the actual event as well. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that I'm so privileged to have you on the advisory committee for the Resilient Australia Alliance, which is C2C's national focus on building community resilience capabilities in every business across Australia. So that's a big aim for 2021 and 2022. Now, I often say businesses are communities, and particularly in regional and remote communities. And by building connections and capabilities in businesses, we can build it across communities too. So can I ask, what's the biggest opportunity you see from the Resilient Australia Alliance and how business communities can build community resilience?
Yeah, it's funny, oftentimes I think people forget the key roles that businesses can and should play in every aspect of resilience, from before the shocks to during to afterwards. I'll just give you a few quick stories. One is we've seen regularly that businesses are the anchors in communities hit by shocks, right? Businesses are the ones who've been there. They know who comes in. They're a natural node in those networks. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Virgil Storr, S-T-O-R-R, has written a little bit about this, about how these local businesses themselves, especially small entrepreneurs, are really the core network members during shocks who can help us get tied together. So that's the first thing, right? To recognize the role they should play. And then, more broadly, what is it that they should be doing? Well, first of all, those businesses hopefully are engaged in the community, right? They're supporting local 5Ks, and they're putting up signs for the newest whatever event that's happening nearby, and they're encouraging people to use their stores for meetings for this and that, the other policy or this kind of rally, right? Local businesses really are the beating heart of communities. We see this in COVID-19 right now, and so many are really ailing. My dad actually studied businesses. He studied entrepreneurial behavior. This is the critical stuff to keep us healthy economically, but also keeping us connected. So I would say, first of all, recognizing the role of especially small businesses as well, but even large ones. We know that Walmart, for example, was much more successful as bringing down bottled water to New Orleans after the shock of Hurricane Katrina than the federal government was. They had the logistics in place. They had the stores and the trucks ready to go. So whether you're a small business on the corner or a large one with a national distributed network, both of those kind of businesses are really key components. In Japan, for example, after the shocks, businesses gave out free cell phones and free Wi-Fi to people so they could get in touch with their loved ones. These are all things the government cannot do, right? So we need business partners to be part of what we're doing as an overall process. And also, of course, they live there. Many of these local businesses, of course, they're embedded in the community. They opened a business because they saw a need there. So again, it's a bottom-up process. They saw a local need. They know people going on. And I hope, and I think this is true too, many business owners want to be engaged in building communities, building strong communities. We think about it this way. If you have a strongly connected neighborhood where people feel safe and connected and can walk around, local businesses benefit, right? When they're not afraid of going outside, they're not afraid of crime, right? There's a nice walking path near an ice cream store, which is near a supermarket, which is near the post office, which is right near a library, right? Those kind of ecologies of businesses are what we need, right? What you don't want to have is a community, whatever size, large or small, where people don't feel comfortable, where they're worried about crime, they're worried about going outside, right? Those are the places where businesses don't do so well. So businesses should be engaged and motivated to be involved in the process of building these kind of community ties, and also being so involved, right, in the processes of disaster recovery. Again, they can see in a much better way and a clearer way what the business needs than someone based, 1,000 miles away in the central government.
So true, so true. And I'm so excited about a few of the initiatives we've got coming in this space, as well as the Resilient Australia Alliance. We're also leading an initiative called the Disaster Giving Collective, which is to set some national guidelines around good disaster giving, which is inclusive of and considerate to the small businesses in those communities that get really impacted, not even by, the fire damage or whatnot, but just by the help that's coming in that puts these businesses out of business. I think businesses have such an important role in communities to build resilience and to connect communities. And it's a really good time now to take a different approach to thinking about the businesses and the role they can play. Now, I could literally talk to you for hours and hours, but I'm not going to. So my final question is always the same. Can I ask, what would be the 2 things that you'd like to be done differently in the disaster space?
Oh, for sure. Wow. This is my my favorite rant to give. Okay. So first, let's just talk about, knowing what we have here in terms of ties. So being able to map out clearly communities that are, especially those that are vulnerable to shocks, whether it's a coastal community or community of color in North America, or community that's maybe poor and vulnerable in another society. But first of all, just having enough knowledge of what's going on. I speak to so many disaster managers, to so many people involved who often come in without that kind of data. We have so many easy ways to collect information nowadays, right? We have so many more cell phones, and the computing power of my cell phone is better than the computers that sent people to the moon, right, back in the 1960s. That's my cell phone by itself. We have GIS information, geographic spatial information. So my first pet peeve is we need to do so much more about regularly measuring and mapping social ties in communities, right? We need to have these as public information, not something private that a firm or the government holds, but the community itself should be interested in doing this. There's great work right now going on in Puerto Rico, for example, especially after all the disasters, both the electrical grid disaster and the hurricane disasters down there, to have local residents have a role in mapping out their strengths, their communities, their vulnerabilities, and their social ties. Such an important thing. So that's one big area. We should really be thinking about, do we know our own community? Do we have not just, my intuition, but well mapped out, clearly delineated understanding of where do we have the strongest connections and the weakest ones? Again, because you can think about it, right? Those areas that we know to have weaker social ties, that's where we need the investments, right? It's not that the communities with the best social ties need everything that the other ones do. right? This gives us a chance to think through, look, maybe starting the train in this area, or having more bus services over here, or putting a library nearby, or putting a food distribution center. Those are the kind of resources we should be distributing, not based on things like wealth, but rather based on social ties. That's the first thing. The other would be just our overall way of investing. As we discussed briefly already, so much more money in our societies around the world, Japan, maybe Australia, New Zealand, certainly North America, is pouring into physical infrastructure, right? Because we think we know what kind of shocks are coming. This is often the case of fighting the last war. I'll give you a quick example from Japan. In the 1960s, after a series of tsunami, some Japanese communities built really high seawalls, like 15, 20-meter seawalls, right? That's huge. And some of them went bankrupt building these walls, and they thought they were safe. And they were. Between the 1960s and 2011, that really, really tall seawall kept all the bad stuff out, all the tsunamis, all the huge seawalls, nothing came in. But in 2011, the tsunami was so powerful, it not only overtopped the wall, it also destroyed it. And then the remnants of the wall trapped that water in the city for days afterwards. So what they thought was a solution to all the problems in the future, this obvious, clear to point to, easy to construct over time, visible symbol, was in fact not the way to save themselves. What would have been a much more powerful way would be community-based evacuation methods, recognition of the signs of tsunami. They couldn't even see the tsunami coming, the wall was so tall initially, right? So those are the kind of things, we prepare, we invest in this physical infrastructure, not thinking through where is the best return. And we have several papers on this now, and actually several books too. The importance is these social infrastructure ties, these ties between us, they save lives in ways that it's hard to think about until we don't have those connections, right? It's so important that we begin thinking through early, why are we investing money again in this seawall? Why are we building this, higher highway or bridge or whatever? Does the community nearby have a say in this? Are they part of the conversation? Are we including them? And are they getting pride of place? Are they the ones that we're building for? Or is this some kind of national project that we just happen to find funding for? So I think those two areas, mapping out, knowing what we have, and then investing really strongly in social infrastructure. I think those are the two things we should be doing.
I could not agree more. I love both of those. And I have to say that both of those actually fit into some of the grants that we're waiting for, and also some other initiatives that we're currently talking with government and hoping to include you in as well. It's so simple though, isn't it? Like it's, again, remove one big building and reinvest it into the people, and then the outcomes will just be priceless in many ways, because it's saving lives. And then also, as we like to look at it too, it's saving livelihoods. Daniel, thank you so much. I am so grateful to have you on. I've been talking to Daniel Aldrich, and he's the professor and director of the Resilience and Security Studies program at Northeastern University in the States. And very luckily for C2C, he's a member of our advisory committee for the Resilient Australia Alliance. Daniel's been talking to me about social capital, the foundation for building national resilience. Thanks so much for Daniel. Can't wait to talk again.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That's the end of this episode of Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast, which I hope you found to be relevant, informative, and inspiring. If you're interested in participating in the conversation or to connect with me personally, please visit corporate2community.com. Until the next episode, stay safe, and remember, we all have a role to play in thinking differently and doing differently before, during, and after disasters.